past experiences myself by readopting an old ego state, as well as persona, to something that was more adaptable, so that I could, I guess, function in the scenario that I was in. And it worked and it helped. Yes. But it also, I neglected and ignored all of the underlying issues that were there in the first place. And so everything sort of resurfaced eventually. Yeah. Because I guess I wasn't putting enough attention on the growth aspect, you know, like you were saying, going back to those roots and, yes, and sort of replanting yourself.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's where the metaphor of the tree is a generally useful one, because the suggestion that the tree just knows how to grow on growing, in effect, gives the suggestion that homeostasis, without calling it that, is what will bring about therapeutic change. That once the tree, i.e. the person, accepts that self-regulation, then they will just grow through anything and become who they should be, which was inevitable all along. There's no need to suppress the past or overcome the past or fight. The tree knows how to bend with the wind. It doesn't resist it. It changes with the seasons, and its roots run deep and take only what it needs. And that overall suggests adaptation and homeostasis. That's where the power, I think, of metaphor comes in. But knowing when to use it's important too.
Right. So, so when that sort of technique needs to be utilized with a patient, I guess it's important to make sure that they don't stay there, that they don't remain sort of infantilized or in this like overly attached or identified with this previous ego state or persona.
Oh yeah, definitely. Which is why I very often speak out against inner child therapy. And there are people who say that they benefited from it, but we both, Paul and I both know of people who have been really badly damaged by the suggestion that they become children again, in effect. Yeah. Particularly if they've been abused, because they lose all their power, they become victims once more. And the complex then that's formed around the imago of the abuser starts to gain power on the inside, and the abuse takes on a different form. They get re-traumatized through the memory of it, which very often these idiot therapists turn that thing into a real sub-personality, a reified dissociation. Yes. And all you're doing is feeding the bloody thing, you know, instead of dealing with it. Yeah. So I have issues with inner child therapy for that reason. We can't be children again. We have to grow. Acknowledge the wound for sure, but like the tree that heals itself, we have to grow on growing.
Right.
That's such an important thing.
And I guess it's also when the only, I guess, more well-adapted ego state that they had was in childhood, I guess it would be better to like maybe utilize one that's older if they have it.
Yes, if they do, if you have to, and this is the art of therapy in the sense that is the assessment, the ongoing, updated, modified assessment based on the interaction with the other person. If you think and if you make that clinical decision that you do have to go back to a childish ego state because that's where their stability was, once you reach it, you must encourage the child to grow with the potential that was latent in them then. Right. And, not to grow with the wound, but to bypass it, like a knight would move on the chessboard, just to jump over it, to move forward and to grow. That's, I think, is perfectly valid because you're reaching into the suggestion that the genome can heal this. And the potential that was latent then existed in the genome. It's still there and it will move it forward and you'll be okay. We'll get you past this. You don't have to suffer. You don't have to be fixated. Complexes are weird things. The more that you treat them as real people, the more of a problem they become. Oh, you endow them with an autonomy beyond that they originally had. If you treat them with a character, and if you have a psychological model like a Jungian one, the complex suddenly has a shadow. The complex suddenly has an anima, you know, because these are the constructs that we believe in. If we follow Jung and we believe in that, we create an absolute monster. Yeah. And you can't get rid of it.
It's why we've moved away to some extent from those concepts, isn't it? You know, they still have currency for us. The minute you start to think of, say, like for women, the animus as being some kind of, you know, real thing inside a woman's psyche that is brutalizing and murderous and could just literally snuff out, you know, any kind of psychological well-being in an instant. It's such a dangerous suggestion, that really. And if you impose that, and then that woman then continues to self-suggest that, I mean, it's not, you know, not heading for a good outcome there. So we've moved away from that for that reason, haven't we?
We have, because in the real world, these things are dangerous when they become turned into real things as such. We have to remember that there is a basis to them, which is genetic. The anima as we experience it is genomic. There's no question about that. We are born, and I believe Jung was absolutely right, with an anticipation. As men, we are born with an expectation of experiencing women, and that is partly reproductive, it's partly psychosocial, but it's there. And some elements of that appear to be inherited as complete images, because some men respond to certain kinds of women and not others on the basis of that image, which is further reducible, if you like, to the notion of a platonic form of the image, which is even further removed from consciousness and much more likely then to be genomic. So we have that. But if you then turn that into a real internal woman, you are creating a terrible problem for yourself. You really are. It's that thing which is projected in anticipation onto a woman for the purpose of relating. That's what the genome wants. It doesn't want you to divide on the inside and not relate to a real woman, because its purpose is to reproduce ultimately. That's why we have our genetics. That's why it pushes us to do that, and then to adapt in whatever healthy way we can in order to survive. It's not healthy to split on the inside and to generate all these alternative personalities that run around rampant and affect your physiology and then affect your psychosocial functioning as well. That is completely wrong, in my view. It's dangerous. It's a daft idea. But as an image, yes, of course, these images turn up and we relate to them, but we relate to them as a psychologism, which is the projection of something which is so unconscious, it's genetic. And as it approaches consciousness, it takes on this projected form, which is pushed out, and we experience it in that way. And then there's some kind of resonance between that and, say, women that we meet in the outer world. And to the extent that there is resonance is the extent to which we feel we want to relate to that particular person. And then that's modified through our experience. That then is the complex, the anima complex, if you like. But the anima then biologically is going to be based on our ancestral experience of women to some extent, but it's broader than just women. We have to remember it's what's projected onto them. The anima fundamentally is relating, and how you work that out is say, well, if the anima is a real thing, where will it operate and where will it not operate? It has to operate wherever there is relating, and it does. If you try to find some aspect of relating where it is absent, you probably won't be able to find one. So therefore, it's synonymous with it. Okay, got that now. This is how I worked it out, if you like, in terms of working with real people and seeing where the gaps in Jung's theory, when it gets overgeneralized, are. It's always present there. And the equivalent in women appears to be the thing that he called the animus. Both of them are based on ancestral experience. Just as Paul was saying before about the fact that the bad boy thing is so deeply ingrained, it is almost certainly genetic and Paleolithic, and to do with adapting to the anticipation of some men being that way, and of them being able to control resources through their aggression, through their cunning, through their intuition, whatever it might be. And therefore, in a competitive environment, that might be advantageous. So therefore, they're going to biologically expect some men to be that way. Later on, that gets evolved, and then some women will find the more chivalrous medieval knight kind of figure to be more interesting, because they are more protective of women, apparently, rather than being exploitative and destructive. But that baseline Stone Age adaptation is still there, as well as the medieval knight, and so on, with and all these other adaptations that occur. And it's the same with the anima too.
It has to be
Right.
seen as a last resort, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It has obviously has had and still does sometimes have some survival value, but
Yeah.
other than that, it's
Yeah.
not what you would choose in an
No.
adaptive sense
No.
in terms of a relationship to an outer man or woman.
No. There are men like that. There
Of
are men who are
course.
that destructive
Yeah.
and vile and
Yeah.
horrible.
Yeah.
We all know that. And there are destructive women as well, who, through their behaviour, warrants, in a certain sense, the projection of all the dark stuff that men have accumulated genetically since the Stone Age with respect to the expectation of women. But there are also lots of great stuff about women and lots of great stuff about men.
Yeah.
And then away from the gender, there's also our innate essence as individual human beings. All of that's genetic too, and it unfolds through lifespan development.
Right. I think there's also the issue of, and I'm pretty sure we've talked about this before, of people and patients that just come in off the street who have no idea about these concepts and theories and stuff, and what that can do when you try to introduce it to them, and and depending on what way. I feel like it's best to just try to get through to them in their own language, deliver the message in a way that's not harmful,
Definitely.
something practical,
Yes.
more human.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Every time. Yeah.
When we would work with couples and it was specifically a relationship issue within that relationship, or it may include projections outside of it, as in that recent video that James published to do with projecting outside of a relationship, then we would introduce, if it was necessary, and it usually would be at some point, Jung's model of the anima and the animus and relating and alchemy, and that was the right resolution to do it. But if someone came in and they were depressed, say, or in a high state of anxiety, or with OCD, or with some psychosomatic issue, it wouldn't be appropriate to discuss that at all. But specifically with that, yes. And the book that we would often encourage people to get would be John Destian's book, Coming Together, Coming Apart, The Union of Opposites in a Love Relationship, which is based very much on the rosarium, the alchemical rosarium. But we would let them know that that was metaphorical. And the process that's put into metaphor in the rosarium is a mirror of a psychological process of transformation through relating. So we'd make it real and something that they could experience, rather than it being just all theoretical.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of young men at the moment, and I'm sure you guys who are in that sort of age group at the moment have seen this, are being misled massively on the internet by a selective version of Jung's theory, and the psychologizing of relationship into that form where they become vulnerable, paradoxically, to women through the concept of the anima. I don't mean vulnerable to decent women, I mean vulnerable to the dark side of the way that some women behave. And the same is true for women as well. Through the way that the animus is pushed out there and Jung's ideas are pushed at the moment on the internet, there is this, I think this is what Pauline was trying to say, this overamping of the negative dark inner animus which eats away at a woman, which is an awful form of suggestion, which, if they internalize that, effectively becomes an autonomous complex backed up by culture to say that this thing is real. And then that squares the influence, and it'll destroy them on the inside, and also prevent them from relating externally properly. The same dynamic is at work with this notion of the negative anima as well. But if you reduce it down and say, look, it's just about relating, and it's about your individual, your lifespan development, those two strands will pretty much cure everything. And that sounds awfully simple, but it is. They're the two strands, relating and developing. Those two things are right. Most things will self-regulate.
It's a personification of it that's the problem, really, which you can understand, obviously, psychologically and socioculturally how that's happened. But, nonetheless, it does reify things, and it does make things more real than they really are. And, you talk about, say, John Destian's book. I mean, yes, we have given it out, but it is a very technical book.
It is,
And, people have to be up for that, don't they? And they have
do.
to want to read, and they want to have to come in at that level.
Yeah, true.
And some couples are very ordinary, and they're not asking for that. They don't require it, in which case just a simple approach, like you say, to do with relating, and using that kind of language is going to be far more appropriate.
Yeah. And just to put that into context, it would be different from the kind of counselling relationship and talking about compromise.
Oh gosh, yeah.
For example,
Definitely.
They always talk about compromise.
They do.
Whereas, to be honest, I would get so complexed about that. I would say to people that it's not about compromise, because compromise suggests loss.
Giving something up.
It's about complementarity, which means adding to one another.
Yes.
Rather than, you compromise to satisfy me, I would say let's complement one another, let's grow together.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the metaphor of the tree and so on, and the fact that if you do grow together, everybody benefits, everything benefits, the system is stable. But compromise is an aggressive demand to make on someone. You compromise to suit me.
Yes.
Awful. Yeah. And when two people are at it, both demanding compromise, you have a broken system.
You do.
And broken systems can carry on for a long time in a dysregulated state, breaking ever more parts of that system, including somebody's biology and their social relationships.
It suggests loss, doesn't it?
Loss,
a deficit to yourself and the other person,
yeah.
if you insist on that.
Yeah.
Far better to get to a point where you can value difference.
Yes.
And see that as being beneficial in some way.
And it adds to...
It does add.
Adds to you as a person to accommodate somebody else's growth. At that point, I would definitely suggest to people that they begin to appreciate the reality of the unconscious and the fact that it is dynamic, and that they'll find loads of things out about one another that are really interesting that they've never experienced or understood before, and how the psyche as a whole between them is regulating even the suffering that they've been going through in order for that to change and to grow, so they can pass through winter and into spring again. So to continue the metaphor I was using earlier, that gets it off the surface, and it also prepares people for suggestions, what Jay Haley would call embedded suggestions, and making small changes which then add up incrementally to generating greater change. If you do that, you're getting the cooperation of the conjoint psyche of the relationship, because although it's in conflict, at some point they got on together. And that ego state between them, that shared getting on together and mutual attraction and love for one another, is still there. It's stored in the rings of the tree. It hasn't gone away. It's just been grown over a little bit by perhaps some unpleasant seasons. Of course, the rings are narrow. But if it's nurtured, the rings will expand and the growth will continue. And I think that's a more healthy way of looking at things, because you're getting them to draw on that, literally like through the roots, draw on what they don't know about one another, but the fact that they did love one another once.
Yes. And
that is still there, probably behind the scenes. So even where there have been infidelities and people have been deeply hurt, to depersonalize that without dehumanizing it, because this can happen under instinctive pressure, and a person has no choice about that sometimes, about how they've been pressured. That's a more fundamental basis for forgiveness than simply saying, well, you compromise or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But there is an element in human nature which is so impersonal, unless you can sink in with that through a naturalistic approach to relationships. So that would be on a couples or relationship therapy level, how we would work and do work.
Yeah, well, John Destin himself, who wrote Coming Together, Coming Apart, was a divorce lawyer before he became a Jungian analyst.
Oh, jeez.
Yes, and so he kind of saw what happens to couples in the raw, and it kind of led him to the conclusion that really you were just seeing another kind of passion, really, the passion that was once in the form of love, turned into hate for one another, but it's still passion.
Whichever it's still passion.
Whichever sign you assign it, nonetheless it's still passion between those two people. And you could see how that could be used as fuel for change in a relationship, and be very productive.
If there's grounds within the relationship, and you'll detect that ground, it is a figure ground thing. The figures of the couple that stand forward. The ground is the background of their life and their context that has produced this current situation. If you can detect that wider picture and see if there's room there for them, then you see, hate isn't the worst thing. Repulsion is the worst thing. Hate is a negative form of attraction, but it's still attraction.
It is.
Right.
Love is a form of positive attraction. Repulsion is the opposite of attraction. And if a couple are in a state where they repel one another, and that is a visceral and instinctive repulsion, there's probably no chance. It's probably run its course, because their instincts are literally repelling them from one another, or one person is repelled now. But if there's still a passionate attachment, even if it's felt as hate, it's still a form of attraction. It's just got a negative sign attached to it in those circumstances. So working with relationships, you need to look at the figures, and you need to look at the background and the connection between the two as a whole picture.
Indifference, I think indifference as well. I mean, if one member of the relationship is indifferent, I mean, then it truly feels dead, at least on one end.
Yeah, that can happen. That can happen. Yeah, you see where a couple might, or one member of a couple might say, my partner turned off the road. I looked in the mirror, and he or she had turned off the road. And then the person who turned off the road is, as you say, indifferent. At that point, that indifference starts to turn into repulsion. And then there's no passion there, there's no conjoinity there at all, no shared vision, no growth. And that is probably on its way out at that point, as you say.
Also, the other person will become increasingly under instinctive pressure to maybe go elsewhere, because, as you say, that person's just turned their back on them, and it's not going with them on the journey. So you could see how that person would fall victim to that kind of thing.
Their instincts will try and push them. You could call that a kind of shit testing, and it can come from a man to a woman as well as from a woman to a man. That, say in this example, the man might indulge in a series of infidelities in order to shit test the woman, to say, well, do you really want me, or have you actually turned off the road, and it's only my money you're here for, or whatever. And you can see these patterns breaking down. And if the woman says, no, I'm going to fight for this relationship, well, he'll stop probably at that point, and everything will just rush back towards her, and then you have to sort out the fine detail of that. But if she's just indifferent, as you say, then he'll probably just carry on his journey without her.
Right.
For example.
Yeah. Well, thank you a lot. That was big, even for me, to look at things as complementary rather than compromise, because I think
compromise is negative.
I tend to do that even, in my own personal life, to look at things often as a compromise or a loss of something,
Yes, you lose something of yourself the moment you do that.
So some people, when they get personally insulted in a relationship issue, they see that something's happened that's diminished them. So there's a sense of loss in that sense. And then to ask that person to further compromise is to add insult to that injury, and to being diminished even further. So the building up of complementarity is a positive thing, a positive suggestion, even if that suggestion only tests out the psyche of the couple involved, to see whether they're in resonance with that idea, or they're rejecting of it, or only one of them is accepting it. And then it's like, well, will the other one come on board with that, or how is it going to go? And it can get very complicated.
Thank you for watching this episode of Jung To Live By. If you haven't already, make sure you download our free PDF for integrating your shadow. It includes the most advanced theory on the topic available anywhere on the internet, as well as a full practical breakdown. If you've ever wanted to integrate your shadow, this is honestly the way to do it. Thanks again for watching, and take care.